My dear friends, there is something paradoxical about the human heart. The one who runs the fastest from love is often the one who feels it most deeply. The avoidant soul, who pushes others away out of fear, wakes up one day to discover that the one they fled from now lives rent-free in the cathedral of their mind, not because you chased them, but because God used absence to awaken presence. Let us reflect on what happens when the avoidant realizes they can't stop thinking about you, not as romance alone, but as a spiritual truth. For there is divine choreography in every delay, every silence, every hidden ache. The soul who fears love is often the one who has glimpsed its terrible beauty. They do not retreat because they do not feel. They retreat because they feel too much. In the presence of real love, the avoidant heart begins to tremble, not because it is threatened, but because it is revealed. Love exposes. It reflects. It holds up a mirror, and suddenly the person who has spent years hiding behind detachment and logic sees themselves with unfamiliar clarity. You see, love does not come wearing chains. It does not force, manipulate, or possess. What it does, quietly, powerfully, is reflect. It shows a person who they are when they are truly seen, not for their masks, their success, or their performance, but for their essence. And that is what frightened them. In your presence, they saw something that words could not explain, an invitation to be known, not fixed, not controlled, just seen, and to someone who has survived life by hiding, this is the most terrifying intimacy of all. That you saw them, truly saw them, and did not flinch, that you stayed, that you loved them not because of their strength, but despite their weakness. So they ran, not because you were too much, but because you made them feel deeply in a world that taught them to stay numb. You brought a mirror, not a trap, but they mistook that reflection for danger, because if they stood in front of it long enough, they would have to face their wounds, their guilt, their unworthiness. And that felt unbearable, but now, in the silence, they remember. They remember the safety of being seen, the comfort of not having to perform, the peace that comes when love doesn't demand anything, yet gives everything. And slowly they begin to realize what they feared was not you. It was the version of themselves they saw in your eyes, unmasked, vulnerable, loved without condition, and that kind of love doesn't trap. It sets the soul free. Would you like me to expand the next keynote in the same tone and style? Certainly. Here is an expanded version of the mind cannot banish what the soul recognizes, in the style of Fulton J. Sheen, without a heading, there is a great war that rages within every human being, the war between the mind and the soul. The mind is clever, quick to reason, trained to forget, to suppress, to rewrite memories so they no longer sting. It says, move on, forget them, you don't need this. And for a time it works. They fill the hours with distraction, busyness, noise, and surface-level connections. The world applauds them for their control, for their stoicism, for their ability to let go. But what the mind tries to exile, the soul quietly shelters. The soul knows truth. It speaks in silence. It remembers without effort. It grieves without being taught how. The soul does not obey the timelines of logic or the slogans of self-help. It is not fooled by distance or absence. The one it recognizes, it keeps. So though they convince themselves they've moved on, that you were just a passing chapter, something curious begins to happen. In quiet moments, your name resurfaces. In dreams, your face returns. A song, a scent, a street corner, and suddenly, everything the mind buried is awakened again. Not by force, but by the unshakable knowing of the soul. Why? Because you were not just another experience. You were a mirror to eternity, a glimpse of something they didn't understand, but could not forget. The soul saw you, and once the soul sees, it does not unsee. They try to rationalize it. It was just chemistry. I was vulnerable. It wasn't real. But that voice is always quieter than the one that whispers. But they made you feel safe, seen, alive. The mind can argue against memory, but it cannot silence what the soul has written in ink. There is a sacred ache when someone we once held is no longer near, but still feels near. When someone we try to forget seems to follow us, not in body but in essence. That is not madness. That is the soul testifying this mattered. And so the avoidant sits, restless, wondering why thoughts of you will not leave, why they're drawn back to a person they convinced themselves to let go of, why the memory of your patience, your presence, your peace lingers like incense in a chapel long after the candles have burned out. Because you were never just a thought. You were a soul-to-soul encounter, and while the mind is good at forgetting, the soul is designed to remember. Would you like me to expand the next keynote? Absence is God's greatest teacher. In the same style. Certainly, here is an expanded version of Absence is God's greatest teacher. In the style of Fulton J. Sheen without a heading. There are truths we never learn in presence, only in absence. There are lessons the soul cannot grasp while hands are held, voices are near, and hearts are comforted. God, in His infinite wisdom, sometimes withdraws what we desire most, not as punishment, but as preparation. For the soul matures in the silent spaces, in the echoes of what once was. When the avoidant walks away, they often believe they are walking into freedom. They breathe easier for a time, relieved of the vulnerability, the pressure, the closeness that made them feel so exposed. But what they do not realize is that in choosing absence, they have stepped into the classroom of God. Because absence is not just a void. It is a mirror with sharper edges. It reveals what noise once covered. It brings clarity where confusion lived. It turns down the volume of distraction so that the whispers of the heart can finally be heard. And slowly, painfully, they begin to feel the loss, not just of a person, but of the peace that person carried, the safety that presence provided, the love that asked for nothing but gave everything. They begin to notice the difference between being alone and being lonely. The quiet becomes louder than any argument ever spoken, and it is there, in that holy hollow, that God begins to do His work, not by forcing guilt, but by awakening memory, not by shouting, but by stirring longing. It is in absence that a person realizes what they once had, and more importantly, who they once were in that presence. Because sometimes it takes losing someone to discover what they meant. And sometimes God allows that space, that ache, not to torment, but to teach, to refine, to resurrect. The avoidant may not admit it. They may go on pretending they are unaffected. But every soul, no matter how hardened, has moments when they sit alone and feel the quiet press of conviction. And it is in that moment, when all the distractions fade and all the defenses fall, that the truth arrives like a gentle wind. They were not just anyone. And now, in their absence, I feel the weight of what I walked away from. God uses that silence like a surgeon uses a scalpel, not to wound, but to heal what pride refused to touch. And so, absence becomes the teacher the avoidant never asked for, but deeply needed. Because presence can comfort, but only absence can confront. And in that confrontation, a new kind of seeing is born. Would you like me to continue with fear makes them flee, but love pulls them back? Next in the same style, certainly. Here is an expanded version of fear makes them flee, but love pulls them back, in the style of Fulton J. Sheen without a heading. Fear is the first language of the wounded heart. It whispers, don't get too close. They'll see too much. They'll leave eventually, so leave first. And so, the avoidant runs, not because they do not care, but because caring feels like danger. To be loved is to be seen, and to be seen is to be vulnerable. and vulnerability, for the soul that has built walls for survival, feels like standing naked in a storm. They flee not from you, but from the unfamiliar safety you offered. They flee from the terrifying idea that perhaps, just perhaps, they are lovable after all, that someone could stay, that someone could choose them without condition, without needing to fix or change them. And that kind of love feels too good to trust, so they retreat. They armor themselves in silence. They speak in short answers. They distract themselves with noise, with people, with schedules. They convince themselves that freedom is found in detachment, that the heart is safer when untouched. But what they cannot outrun is the memory of peace, and not the peace of solitude, but the peace of being understood, the kind of peace that only ever existed in your presence. You didn't demand explanations, you didn't try to rescue, you simply remained gentle, steady, present. And now, in the distance they chose, that contrast is becoming clearer, because fear is powerful. But love is persistent. It begins to pull on them quietly, through memories they didn't invite, through dreams they cannot control, through the ache that arises at the sound of a certain laugh or the shape of a shadow on the wall. They begin to realize that what they fled from is what they crave most, the safety of being loved without needing to earn it. And the love you gave, it had no terms, it didn't chase, it didn't demand, but it stayed planted. And from that stillness, God begins to pull them gently back, not by force, but by the magnetism of grace. For perfect love does not chase, it draws, it waits, it calls by presence, not pressure. And slowly, the fear that once made them flee begins to crumble under the weight of longing, longing for truth, longing for connection, longing for the one place where they didn't need to hide. They begin to walk back, not because they've figured it all out, but because something inside them knows, whatever that was, it was real, and real is rare, real is holy, real is worth returning to. Because in the end, fear may push them away, but only love has the power to bring them home. Would you like the final keynote, Let God Finish What He Started? Expanded in the same tone? Certainly. Here is the expanded version of Let God Finish What He Started, in the tone and style of Fulton J. Sheen, without the heading. There is a sacred temptation in the heart of those who love deeply. A rescue, to return, to reach back when someone who once ran away finally looks back. When the avoidant begins to awaken, when their silence gives way to subtle signs of remembrance, your heart may stir with the urge to help them finish the journey they abandoned. But do not interfere with what is holy, for there are some awakenings that must happen without your presence, without your words, and without your intervention. God began something in their soul the moment you stepped away in peace, instead of chasing in fear. Your absence created the silence in which heaven could finally speak. Now let God finish what He started. You were the seed, not the sunlight. You were the messenger, not the message. And if the roots are truly growing in their heart, they must break through the soil on their own. If you interrupt the process too early, you risk pulling them from the ground before they've taken hold of the lesson. Let them sit in the space they tried to avoid. Let them wrestle with the emptiness they once chose. Let them feel the full weight of what they walked away from, not to punish them, but to purify them. This is not cruelty. This is sanctification. God does not rush transformation. He is not interested in momentary regret or emotional apologies. He is after resurrection, a turning, a surrender, a new beginning rooted in truth, and that cannot be microwaved. It must be marinated in reflection, repentance, and revelation. If they are thinking of you now, it is not random. It is divine. But do not confuse divine stirring with divine timing. God does not operate according to your need to know or your desire to be chosen again. He operates according to what will bring true healing to you and to them. So, when they remember you, when they feel the ache of your absence, and when they realize they cannot banish you from their mind, let that be between them and the God who placed you in their path. You were not just a passing character in their story. You were a chapter God wrote on purpose. But now, the pen is no longer in your hand. It is in God's, and you must trust Him to write the ending without your interference. He who authors beginnings also completes them. Let Him finish it, with or without their return, knowing that nothing done in love is ever wasted, and nothing surrendered to God is ever lost. So, when the avoidant finally realizes they can't stop thinking about you, know this: you were never forgotten in heaven. You were never a mistake. You were an assignment. And if the soul awakens, it is not because of your pursuit, but because of your prayers, your patience, and your peaceful letting go. In the end, what cannot be explained by logic is often God's poetry in motion. And you, dear soul, were part of the most divine verse.